The Stoker and the Stars. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jason Mills. The Stoker and the Stars by Algirdas Jonas Budrys, better known as Algis Budrys, and writing here under the name John A. Sentry. Know him? Yes, I know him. Knew him. That was 20 years ago. Everybody knows him now. Everybody who passed him on the street knows him. Everyone who went to the same schools, or even to different schools in different towns, knows him now. Ask them. But I knew him. I lived 3 feet away from him for a month and a half. I shipped with him and called him by his first name. What was he like? What was he thinking, sitting on the edge of his bunk with his jaw in his palm and his eyes on the stars? What did he think he was after? Well, I think he... I think I never did know him after all. Not well. Not as well as some of those people who are writing the books about him seem to. I couldn't really describe him to you. He had a duffel bag in his hand and a packed air suit on his back. The skin of his face had been dried out by ship's air, burned by ultraviolet and broiled by infrared. The pupils of his eyes had little cloudy specks in them where the cosmic rays had shot through them. But his eyes were steady and his body was hard. What did he look like? He looked like a man. It was after the war and we were beaten. There used to be a school of thought among us that deplored our combativeness. Before we had ever met any people from off-Earth, even, you could hear people saying we were toughest, cruelest life form in the universe, unfit to mingle with the gentler, wiser races in the stars, and a sure bet to steal their galaxy and corrupt it forever. Where these people got their information, I don't know. We were beaten. We moved out beyond Centaurus and Sirius, and then we met the Jeks, the Noseway, the Lud. We tried terrestrial know-how, we tried production miracles, we tried patriotism, we tried damning the torpedoes and full speed ahead, and we were smashed back like mayflies in the wind. We died in droves, and we retreated from the guttering fires of a dozen planets. We dug in, we fought through the last ditch, and we were dying on Earth itself before Baker mutinied, shot Cope, and surrendered the remainder of the human race to the wiser, gentler races in the stars. That way we lived. That way we were permitted to carry on our little concerns, and mind our manners. The Jeks and the Lud and the Noseway returned to their own affairs, and we knew they would leave us alone so long as we didn't bother them. We liked it that way. Understand me, we didn't just accept it. We didn't knuckle under with waiting murder in our hearts. We liked it. We were grateful just to be left alone again. We were happy we hadn't been wiped out like the upstarts the rest of the universe thought us to be. When they let us keep our own solar system and carry on a trickle of trade with the outside, we accepted it for the fantastically generous gift it was. Too many of our best men were dead for us to have any remaining claim on these things in their own right. I know how it was. I was there 20 years ago. I was a little pudgy man with short breath and a high-pitched voice. I was a typical Earthman. We were out on a god-forsaken landing field on Mars, Macready and I, loading cargo aboard the Serenus. Macready was first officer, I was second. The stranger came walking up to us. "Got a job?" he asked, looking at Macready. Mac looked him over. He saw the same things I'd seen. He shook his head. "Not for you. The only thing we're short on is stokers." You wouldn't know. There's no such thing as a stoker anymore with automatic ships. But the stranger knew what Mac meant. Serenus had what they called an electronic drive. She had to run with an evacuated engine room. The leaking electricity would have broken any stray air down to ozone, which eats metal and rots lungs. So the engine room had the air pumped out of her, and the stokers who tended the dials and set the cathode attitudes had to wear suits, smelling themselves for 12 hours at a time, and standing a good chance of cooking where they sat when the drive arced. Serenus was an ugly old tub. At that, we were the better of the 2 interstellar freighters the human race had left. "You're bound over the border, aren't you?" Macready nodded. "That's right, but I'll stoke." MacReady looked over toward me and frowned. I shrugged my shoulders helplessly. I was a little afraid of the stranger, too. The trouble was the look of him. It was the look you saw in the bars back on Earth, where the veterans of the war sat and stared down into their glasses, waiting for night to fall so they could go out into the alleys and have drunken fights among themselves. But he had brought that look to Mars, to the landing field, and out here there was something disquieting about it. He'd caught Mac's look and turned his head to me. "I'll stoke," he repeated. I didn't know what to say. MacReady and I, almost all of the men in the Merchant Marine, hadn't served in the combat arms. We had freighted supplies and we had seen ships dying on the runs. We'd had our own brushes with commerce raiders, and we'd known enough men who joined the combat forces. But very few of the men came back, and the war this man had fought hadn't been the same as ours. He'd commanded a fighting ship, somewhere, and come to grips with things we simply didn't know about. The mark was on him, but not on us. I couldn't meet his eyes. "Okay by me," I mumbled at last. I saw MacReady's mouth turn down at the corners, but he couldn't gainsay the man any more than I could. MacReady wasn't a mumbling man, so he said angrily, "Okay, bucko, you'll stoke. Go and sign on." "Thanks." The stranger walked quietly away. He wrapped a hand around the cable on a cargo hook and rode into the hold on top of some freight. Mac spat on the ground and went back to supervising his end of the loading. I was busy with mine, and it wasn't until we'd gotten the Serenus loaded and buttoned up that Mac and I even spoke to each other again. Then we talked about the trip. We didn't talk about the stranger. Daniels, the third, had signed him on and had moved him into the empty bunk above mine. We slept all in a bunch on the Serenus, officers and crew. Even so, we had to sleep in shifts, with the ship's designers giving 90% of her space to cargo and 8% to power and control. That left very little for the people, who were crammed in any way they could be. I said empty bunk. What I meant was empty during my sleep shift. That meant he and I'd be sharing work shifts, me up in the control blister parked in a soft chair, and him down in the engine room, broiling in a suit for 12 hours. But I ate with him, used the head with him. You can call that rubbing elbows with greatness if you want to. He was a very quiet man. Quiet in the way he moved and talked. When we were both climbing into our bunks that first night, I introduced myself, and he introduced himself. Then he heaved himself into his bunk, rolled over on his side, fixed his straps, and fell asleep. He was always friendly toward me, but he must have been very tired that first night. I often wondered what kind of life he'd lived after the war, what he'd done that made him different from the men who simply grew older in the bars. I wonder now if he really did do anything different. In an odd way, I like to think that one day, in a bar, on a day that seemed like all the rest to him when it began, he suddenly looked up with some new thought, put down his glass, and walked straight to the Earth-Mars shuttle field. He might have come from any town on Earth. Don't believe the historians too much. Don't pay too much attention to the Chamber of Commerce plaques. When a man's name becomes public property, strange things happen to the facts. It was MacReady who first found out what he'd done during the war. I've got to explain about MacReady. He takes his opinions fast and strong. He's a good man. Is, or was, I haven't seen him for a long while. But he liked things simple. MacReady said the duffel bag broke loose and floated into the middle of the bunk room during acceleration. He opened it to see whose it was. When he found out, he closed it up and strapped it back in its place at the foot of the stoker's bunk. MacReady was my relief on the bridge. When he came up, he didn't relieve me right away. He stood next to my chair and looked out through the ports. "Captain leave any special instructions in the order book?" he asked. "Just the usual. Keep a tight watch and proceed cautiously." "That new Stoker," Mac said. "Yeah?" I knew there was something wrong with him. He's got an old Marine uniform in his duffel. I didn't say anything. Mac glanced over at me. "Well?" "I don't know." I didn't. I couldn't say I was surprised. It had to be something like that about the Stoker. The mark was on him, as I've said. It was the Marines that did Earth's best dying. It had to be. They were trained to be